She did not cry when they moved their baskets away from her. She did not cry when the preacher's wife turned her back, or when the children were pulled aside, as if shame were something they might catch. Eliza Mae Carter sat straight-spined at the end of that long wooden table under the open summer sky. Her hands folded, her plate empty, and her jaw set like iron against the heat. She had buried her brother 6 days ago, and Silver Creek had already decided what kind of woman she was going to be for the rest of her life. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button and follow Eliza all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The church picnic had been Agnes Whitmore's idea, same as every summer going back 15 years. Long tables set beneath the cottonwood trees at the edge of the church ground. White cloth laid over pine boards. Every family in Silver Creek bringing something from their kitchen. Smoked ham, corn, pudding, cold buttermilk biscuits, preserved peaches from last autumn's jars. It was the kind of afternoon that made a person believe the world was orderly and good, that neighbors were neighbors, and that a Colorado summer could wash away the worst of what people carried inside them. Eliza Mae Carter believed none of that anymore. She had arrived early out of habit. She had ironed her dress the night before, the pale blue one with the mended collar, and she had told herself, standing at the cracked mirror above her wash basin, that she had done nothing wrong. That her name was still her name. That Thomas's death did not make her guilty of anything except grief. She had almost believed it too, until she walked across the church lawn and watched the crowd rearrange itself around her like water around a stone. Martha Eldon saw her first and turned to say something to her husband. He glanced over his shoulder, then back at Martha, and they took their basket to the far end of the table without a word. The Hendersons followed, not because anyone told them to, but because that is how towns work. One family moves, and the next one reads it as instruction. By the time Eliza reached the table, there was a clear 6 feet of empty space on either side of her. She sat down. She put her hands in her lap. She did not look up. Around her, conversations continued. Children ran between the tables. Old Reverend Calloway said something about the summer heat, and a few people laughed. The banker, Victor Langley, stood near the water table in his good linen jacket, nodding along to whatever Sheriff Amos Pike was saying. Both men holding their tin cups, like they had not a single concern between them. That was the part that made it hardest. Not the empty seats, not the turned backs, not even the whispers she could hear clearly enough. Thomas Carter stole those men's wages, and she knew it. She had to have known it. No. The hardest part was watching Langley and Pike stand there in the afternoon light, like pillars of the community, comfortable and untouchable, while her brother was 6 days in the ground, and she was sitting alone at a table full of people. She had not touched the food she brought. A jar of blackberry preserves made from berries she and Thomas had picked together last August along the Ridge Trail. She had meant it as a contribution. Now it sat in front of her like a small, sad monument. "You got nerve, I'll give you that." The voice came from behind her left shoulder. She recognized it without looking. Clara Hennessy, wife of the head foreman at the Dutton mine. Clara was not a cruel woman by nature, but she was a social woman, and social women in Silver Creek had learned that standing too close to Eliza Carter these days cost you something you might never get back. Eliza said nothing. "My husband lost $40 in that fund, Eliza. $40. That's 2 months of careful saving." "I know," Eliza said quietly. "I'm sorry for his loss." "Sorry." Clara made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Your brother walked off with the whole miner's relief account and went over that canyon ledge before anyone could ask him a single question, and you sit here eating with decent people and say you're sorry." "I'm not eating," Eliza said. The words came out flat and calm, and Clara had no answer for them. She moved away. Eliza stared at the jar of blackberry preserves. She was still staring at it when she heard the sound, not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore in the way that only purposeful footsteps can be. A steady, unhurried stride crossing the church ground from the direction of the road. No greeting called out. No pause to shake hands or tip a hat to the banker or the sheriff. Just boots on dry summer grass moving in a straight line toward the long table. Toward her. Eliza looked up. Howe was not from town. She would have known him if he were. Silver Creek was small enough that a man like this, broad through the shoulders, dark from long summer hours, under an open sky trail, dust still on his jacket, like he had ridden a good distance that morning, would have been noticed and talked about long before now. He wore his hat low and straight, not cocked to the side the way younger men wore theirs. His face was not unkind, but it was serious. The face of a man who had spent a great deal of time alone with his own thoughts and had made some kind of peace with most of them. He reached the table. He looked at the empty space beside her. He sat down. The picnic went quiet. Not all at once sound doesn't stop like that in real life. But it thinned conversation by conversation, until Eliza could hear the cottonwood leaves moving in the dry August wind above them. The man reached across the table, picked up the jar of blackberry preserves, turned it in his hands once, and set it back down in front of her. "That's good-looking preserves," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had no interest in performing itself for anyone. Eliza found she could not immediately speak. "Move your plate closer, ma'am," he said, and there was something in the simplicity of it that nearly undid her. "I don't eat beside cowards." He was not talking to her. He was talking to all of them, and every person at that table understood it. Sheriff Amos Pike set down his cup. He was a thick man gone heavy in the middle, but still carrying the size of someone who had once been formidable, and he wore that size like a credential. He crossed the lawn in no particular hurry, the way powerful men move when they want you to know they are not worried about you. "Caleb Rowan," he said, stopping at the far end of the table. "Didn't know you were coming down off the mountain." "Didn't figure I needed your permission, Amos." A few people nearby exchanged looks. Nobody in Silver Creek talked to Pike that way. Not openly, not at a church picnic, not with half the town watching. "You're sitting with the Carter woman," Pike said. "I am." "You know what her brother did." Caleb Rowan looked up then directly at the sheriff, and the look was steady and without performance. "I know what people say he did," he said. "That ain't always the same thing." Pike's jaw tightened. "You've been up in those mountains too long, Rowan. You don't know what's been happening in this valley." "I know enough." Caleb turned back to the table. "Enjoy your afternoon, Sheriff." Pike stood there another moment. Then he turned and walked back to Langley, and the two of them spoke in low voices that Eliza could not hear. She was looking at the side of Caleb Rowan's face. "Why?" she asked. The word came out before she could decide whether to say it. He didn't look at her right away. He picked up a biscuit from the center platter, the one nobody had moved because it was closest to her, and set it on the space in front of him. "Because somebody ought to," he said. "You don't know me." "No, ma'am. You don't know anything about my brother." "Not much," he agreed. Eliza's hands were trembling slightly beneath the table. She pressed them flat against her thighs to stop it. "Then why sit here? You've made yourself a problem with the sheriff, with Langley, with half this town." Caleb picked up the biscuit, took a bite, set it back down. He chewed thoughtfully like a man with no plans to be hurried into anything. "Miss Carter," he said, "I've been running a cattle camp up on the Summer Ridge for 11 years. I come down to town 4, maybe 5 times a season. I've sat across a table from Amos Pike and Victor Langley more times than I care to count, and I've watched them treat this valley like it belongs to them personally." He paused. "I saw you walk in. I watched every person at this table shift 6 inches away from a woman who ironed her dress and brought good preserves to a community picnic." He looked at her then directly. "That told me everything I needed to know about who's worth sitting beside." Eliza looked down at the blackberry preserves. She had made them with Thomas. Last August, when everything had still been ordinary and possible and fine. "My brother didn't steal that money," she said. Her voice was barely above a murmur, but it was steady. "He wouldn't. He couldn't. He was saving up to bring our mother out here from Missouri. He was careful with every cent he had." Caleb said nothing. He was listening, which was rarer than most men knew how to be. "Nobody will hear it," she said. "They've decided, and Sheriff Pike has made sure there's nothing left to look at." She stopped. "He fell off a canyon ledge in the dark. That's what they're saying. That he panicked when they figured out what he'd done, and he ran and he fell." "That what you believe?" She raised her eyes to his. Thomas was afraid of exactly two things in this world, she said. Spiders and the dark. He would never have gone near that canyon after nightfall. Not for any reason. Caleb held her gaze for a long moment. No, he said quietly. I don't suppose he would. Something shifted in the air between them. Not warmth, not yet the situation allowed for no such luxury, but recognition. The sense of being genuinely heard by another person, which is a different thing entirely from being listened to. Then Langley was there. Victor Langley was 61 years old, thin-faced and silver-haired. The kind of man who wore his respectability like a freshly pressed suit and expected everyone around him to admire the cut of it. He came alone without Pike, which meant he considered himself sufficient. Miss Carter, he said, I think it might be best for everyone if you went on home. Eliza looked at him. I haven't finished my meal, Mr. Langley, she said. You haven't touched a thing on that table. I'm working up to it. Langley's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. He turned to Caleb. Rowan, I understand you've got summer grazing rights on the upper ridge. Those come through the county land office, as I'm sure you recall. Caleb picked up his tin cup. They do. It would be unfortunate if there were any complications at the next renewal. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Mr. Langley, Caleb said, still in that same unhurried tone. Are you sitting here at a church picnic in front of half of Silver Creek, threatening my grazing lease because I chose where to eat my lunch? Langley smiled. It did not reach his eyes. I'm simply noting that relationships in a community are delicate things. They are, Caleb agreed. He set his cup down. Which is why I'd be careful if I were you about who you're seen pressuring in public. People notice more than you think. Langley looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away. Eliza let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He'll come after you now, she said. He was going to come after me eventually anyway. Caleb reached for the preserves and looked at her. May I? She nodded. He opened the jar and spread a careful portion on what remained of his biscuit. These are genuinely good, he said, and against every reasonable instinct she possessed, Eliza Mae Carter almost smiled. She did not expect to see him again. That was the truth of it, though. She turned it over in her mind all the way home, the 2-mile walk along the summer road with the heat pressing down on her shoulders and the sound of the picnic fading behind her. Caleb Rowan was a mountain man with a cattle camp and apparently no fear of sheriffs or bankers, but he was not her protector. He had made a gesture, a remarkable one, the kind she would probably think about for years. But a gesture was what it was. She did not expect the firewood. It was stacked beside her cabin door the next morning, when she stepped out at first light, a clean cord of pine split, and ready, more than she could have carried herself in 2 trips. And beside it, a flour sack, a paper-wrapped parcel of coffee, and a note weighted down with a river stone. Miss Carter, not Charity. Preparation. If you're willing to listen, I have something to show you. C. Rowan. She read it twice. Then she looked out toward the trail that climbed north into the high country, where the summer ridges turned blue with distance above the valley floor. She made coffee. She was on her 2nd cup when she heard the horse. Caleb Rowan came down the trail at a walk alone, wearing the same jacket as yesterday, but with the trail dust brushed off it. He tied his horse at the post and came to the door without particular ceremony, holding his hat in his hands. I found something, he said when she opened it. Up in the canyon, above the ledge where they say your brother fell. Eliza's hand tightened on the doorframe. What kind of something? He looked at her directly. The kind that means your brother didn't fall. The morning air was still and hot, and smelled of pine resin and dry grass. A single hawk turned in wide circles above the ridgeline. Eliza stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. Tell me everything. He had been up in the canyon for 3 days before the picnic. He told her this at the table, his hands wrapped around the tin cup she'd given him, his hat on the chair beside him. He had heard about Thomas Carter's death the way men hear things in the mountains slowly, at a remove a piece at a time. a rider passing through with news from the valley. Another man at the summer grazing camp mentioning that the miners' fund was gone, and a young man named Carter had gone with it. But something hadn't settled right. Caleb had been running cattle above Briar Canyon for 11 summers. He knew that stretch of country better than most men knew their own front yards. He knew where the ledge was. He knew how wide it was, and how far back from the edge a grown man would have to be standing before a misstep could send him over. "It's not an accident drop," he said. "A man would have to go over that edge with some force behind him. Either he jumped or someone put him there." Eliza's cup was still on the table in front of her, untouched. "What did you find?" she said. He reached into his jacket and set 3 things on the table between them. The first was a torn page from a ledger, small water-stained at one corner, but the figures on it were still clear. Dollar amounts, dates and initials. VL appeared 6 times beside withdrawals that had been marked in the original column as community fund disbursements. The second was a bank receipt, brown with dried blood along the left edge, the kind of blood that comes from a hand wound pressed there and left. The third was a small piece of wood the size of her thumb, with a bullet hole through it, clean and straight. "That's from the fence post," Caleb said, "about 4 feet back from the ledge edge. The bullet went in from a westward angle. Whoever fired it was standing uphill of the post." He paused. "Your brother's dominant hand." "Right. The blood on the receipt matches the height of a wound to the right palm, which is consistent with a man raising his hand to defend himself." Eliza stared at the receipt. She had seen Thomas's hands 1,000 times. She had watched him hold a pen, hold a coffee cup, hold her hand at their mother's grave when they were children, and the world had first shown them how quickly it could take something away. "He was defending himself," she said. "I believe so." "And those initials on the ledger?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Victor Langley," he said. "Same handwriting, same pen pressure. I'm not a document man, but I've seen enough of Langley's written work over the years, land agreement copies, grazing renewal forms, that I'd be willing to swear to the similarity in front of a federal judge." Eliza was silent for a long time. Outside, a summer jay called twice from the pinon tree by the fence line. "They framed him," she said finally. Her voice came out very quiet. "They stole the money themselves. Thomas found out or came close enough to finding out that they couldn't risk him. And then they—" She stopped. "Yes," Caleb said. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth. Not to cry, the grief was there, had been there for 6 days, but right now it was beneath something harder and cleaner. Anger did not fully describe it. It was more like the feeling of standing on solid ground after a very long time of uncertain footing. She knew. She finally completely knew. "We need a federal marshal," she said. "We do. Nearest one with jurisdiction is 3 days' ride." "Then we ride 3 days." Caleb looked at her across the table. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "a trip like that with those men knowing we have this evidence. I know the risk, Mr. Rowan. I'd feel better if you stayed somewhere safe while I—" "No." The word was flat and final. She looked at him without apology. "That is my brother's blood on that receipt. Those are the initials of the man who took his life and then sat across from me at a church picnic and told me to go home. I am not hiding in someone's back room while you carry the truth by yourself." She paused. "I can ride. I can shoot. I'm not a helpless woman, and I am asking you not to treat me like one." A long pause. Caleb looked down at his cup. "No, ma'am," he said. "I can see that clearly enough." He lifted his eyes to hers. "We leave at first light tomorrow. Pack light. Bring the rifle." Eliza nodded. She reached out and carefully, precisely folded the ledger page and the receipt and placed them inside the cover of Thomas's Bible, which lived on the shelf above the stove. She set the piece of wood beside it. Then she turned back to Caleb. "Have you eaten today?" "Not since last night." She moved to the stove. "Then sit down," she said. "We've got a long road ahead, and I won't have you falling out of the saddle before we reach the mountain pass." He sat. Outside, the summer heat pressed down on Silver Creek like a hand, and Amos Pike was somewhere in that town watching the roads, and Victor Langley was somewhere counting money that didn't belong to him. But in Eliza Carter's small, sun-warmed kitchen, two people sat at a table together and planned the beginning of the truth, and that was something neither of them would take back, regardless of what it cost. She didn't know yet what it was going to cost. By sunset, she would. She was at the woodpile behind the cabin stacking the pine that Caleb had brought when she smelled it. Smoke. Not cook-fire smoke. Not the soft, domestic smell of an evening hearth. This was the sharp, greedy smell of something consuming itself faster than it was meant to. She turned. The front corner of the cabin was burning. It moved fast, faster than she would have believed the dry summer wood catching, like it had been waiting for permission. She ran around the side of the cabin and stopped at the corner of the fence line, and she could see them. Two riders on the ridge above the road already pulling away into the trees. One of them paused just long enough to look back. He was wearing a deputy's star. Eliza stood and watched the corner of her home turn to ash. She did not scream. She did not run toward the water barrel in some futile attempt to save what was already gone. She understood with absolute clarity what this fire was and what it meant. It was a message, and it was also a deadline. Whoever had sent those riders had just told her that her time in Silver Creek had run out. She walked back to the cabin and went inside through the rear door, moving fast and deliberate. She took Thomas's Bible from the shelf above the stove, the ledger page and receipt still tucked inside. She took her mother's photo from the wall. She took her sewing kit, her warmest jacket, and the box of cartridges from the top shelf of the wardrobe. She took Thomas's rifle from behind the door. She stood in the center of the room for 3 seconds. The ceiling above the front room was beginning to glow with the heat coming through from outside. She walked out the back door and went straight to the fence where her horse was tied. By the time she had the horse saddled and the saddlebags loaded, the front half of the cabin was gone. She did not look back at it. She rode north toward the mountain trail, toward the high dark ridgeline, where Caleb Rowan's summer camp sat above the valley. The summer night was enormous and hot and full of stars, and below her, the last orange glow of the fire she had not set was the only light in the direction of Silver Creek. She had been right. Thomas had not been careless. He had not been a thief. He had been a young man who found something he was not supposed to find, and they had killed him for it. And then they had spent 6 days turning his name into something shameful, so that his sister would be too broken and too alone to ask the right questions. Eliza Mae Carter pressed her heels into the horse's flanks and rode harder. She was not broken. She was not alone. And she was going to ask every question there was to ask in front of every person who needed to hear the answers, no matter what it took to get there. The mountain trail opened above her in the dark, narrow, and steep and real, and she rode toward it without slowing down. The mountain trail was not kind to riders in the dark. Eliza knew that before she was halfway up it. The horse picked its footing carefully on the loose shale, and she led it, keeping her hands quiet on the reins and her weight low in the saddle, the way Thomas had taught her years ago, when they were still young enough to think that competence could protect a person from everything. The summer night was warm, even at elevation, the air carrying the smell of dry pine, and something faintly electric, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. She found Caleb's camp by the firelight. He was awake. She would learn later that he was almost always awake when something was wrong in the valley below, that he had a cattleman's instinct for trouble, the way some people had an instinct for weather. He came out of the dark at the edge of the firelight before her horse had fully stopped, and he looked at her face, and then at the saddlebags, and then at the rifle laid across her thighs. He didn't ask if she was all right. He could see that she wasn't, and he was smart enough to know that asking the question would cost her something she couldn't spare right now. "They burned it," he said. "The front half. Maybe more by now." She dismounted. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that quietly and privately, in the way a person is proud of a small thing when large things have gone very wrong. Two riders on the ridge above the road. One of them was wearing a deputy's star. Caleb took the horse's reins and tied them at the picket line without another word. He unsaddled the horse himself, which nobody had asked him to do, and checked its feet while he was at it. And then he came back to the fire and poured coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the coals. He handed her the cup. "Sit down," he said. "I'm not—" "I know you're not. Sit down anyway." She sat. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, and exactly what she needed. She held the cup in both hands and stared into the fire. And for the first time since she had smelled the smoke, she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not the anger was still there, clean and useful. But underneath it, the grief. The understanding that the last physical place where Thomas had existed in her daily life was gone now. The shelf above the stove where he used to leave notes. The chair by the window where he read in the evenings. The worn patch on the floorboards near the door where he always set his boots. Gone. She drank the coffee and did not cry, and the fire crackled between her and the dark. "They think they've finished it," she said. Caleb settled himself on the opposite side of the fire. "They think they've frightened you into leaving. Then they didn't pay close enough attention at the picnic." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. "No," he said. "I don't suppose they did." She reached into the saddlebag beside her and took out Thomas's Bible. She opened the cover and checked the ledger page was there and the receipt and the piece of fence post wood, all exactly where she had placed them. She exhaled. "We still have everything," she said. "We do." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Which means we leave before first light. Earlier than I planned." "How much earlier?" "Hour before dawn. Pike will send someone up the north road at sunup to see if you ran. When he finds out you didn't run south, didn't run at all, he's going to start looking at the mountain trail." Eliza nodded. She turned the Bible over in her hands once. Caleb. It was the first time she had used his given name. She noticed it. He noticed it too from the brief stillness in his posture. "What if the marshal doesn't believe us?" she said. "A torn ledger page, a blood-stained receipt, a piece of wood with a bullet hole. It's not nothing. But it's not a signed confession. It's enough to open an investigation. And if Langley has already spoken to someone in the marshal's office, he's got money, he's got connections. He's been running that bank for 20 years. Marshal Daniel Mercer runs out of the Pueblo district," Caleb said. "I know him. Not well, we've crossed paths twice in 11 years, but I know his reputation. He doesn't bend." "You're certain of that?" "As certain as I can be about any man I haven't seen in 3 years. He met her eyes across the fire. "It's the best option we've got, Miss Carter. If you've got a better one, I'm listening." She didn't. And he knew that she knew that, which was why neither of them said anything further about it. She finished the coffee. "I'll sleep 2 hours," she said. "Then I'm ready." He gestured toward the bedroll he had already laid out on the far side of the fire. She looked at it, then at him. "Where will you sleep?" "I don't need much." "That's not an answer." "I'll be fine, Miss Carter." She lay down on the bedroll and looked up at the summer stars through the pine canopy above the camp, and she thought about Thomas, and about the jar of blackberry preserves still sitting on the church picnic table, and about the way Caleb Rowan had picked it up and turned it in his hands like it was worth something, because in his estimation it was. She was asleep in 4 minutes. Howe was still awake when she woke 2 hours later. She didn't remark on it. They broke the camp in near silence, moving efficiently and without wasted motion. And by the time the first gray edge of dawn touched the eastern ridge, they were already an hour up the mountain trail, and the valley below had disappeared behind them. The day came in hot. Summer in the Colorado high country had its own particular quality of heat, thinner than valley heat, but relentless, the sun finding you from every angle against the pale rock faces. By mid-morning, Eliza had rolled her jacket into the saddlebag and pushed her sleeves to the elbow, and the trail had widened enough for them to ride side by side, which was when Caleb began to talk. Not about the case. Not about Pike or Langley, or what waited for them in Pueblo. He talked about the mountains. He told her about the summer camp, how he'd established it 11 years ago, when the valley had started getting crowded with the kind of people who believed that owning a piece of paper with numbers on it meant they owned everything the paper described. How he'd found that he could breathe better at elevation. How the cattle responded differently up here, calmer, less agitated, as if they too understood that altitude put certain things at a manageable distance. Eliza listened. She found to her surprise that she wanted to. "You said you come down 4 or 5 times a season," she said. "Doesn't that get lonely?" He considered the question with the same unhurried attention he seemed to apply to everything. Sometimes. But lonely and alone aren't the same thing in my experience. What's the difference? Alone is a condition. Lonely is what happens when alone starts to feel wrong. He looked at the trail ahead. It hasn't felt wrong most of the time. She thought about that. Most of the time, she repeated. Most of the time, he confirmed and did not elaborate. They rode through a high meadow where the summer grass had gone gold at the tips in the August heat, and somewhere in the tree line above them, a hawk screamed once and went silent. "Tell me about Thomas," Caleb said. The request surprised her. Not the words themselves, but the directness of it. Not, "I'm sorry about your brother," or "It must have been hard," but simply "Tell me about him," as if Thomas Carter were a person worth knowing, rather than a situation to be navigated. She talked for the better part of an hour. She told him about Thomas at 12, already taller than her, and refusing to acknowledge it because she was older, and he thought it might embarrass her. About the way he could fix anything: mechanical watches, harnesses, pump handles, with a patience that came from somewhere she'd never quite located in herself. About his habit of writing things down, everything, dates and figures and observations, in a succession of small notebooks he kept in his coat pocket. About how he had taken the bookkeeping job at the Miners' Relief Fund because he genuinely believed that careful record-keeping was a form of protection for working men who had no other protection. About how he had come to her 2 weeks before he died and said very quietly that he thought something was wrong with the accounts. That figures weren't lining up. That he wasn't sure yet, but he was going to look closer. She stopped. "He told you he suspected something," Caleb said. "I told him to be careful." Her jaw tightened. "I told him to be careful and to come to me before he said anything to anyone else. And he said he would." She looked at the trail between her horse's ears. "The next time I saw him was when they brought him up from the canyon." Caleb was quiet. "He never came to me first," she said. "Which means either he found something and moved before he could, or they found out he was looking and moved before he could." She paused. "I think about that every day. Whether it would have changed anything if he had come to me that same night." "It might have," Caleb said. "Or they might have taken you both." "I know." She exhaled. "I know that. But knowing it doesn't stop the thinking." "No," he said. "It wouldn't." They crossed the high ridge in the early afternoon and dropped down the far side into the next drainage, and the air changed denser, slightly cooler, with the smell of water somewhere below. Eliza's horse picked up its pace without being asked, scenting the creek. They watered the horses and ate dried meat and hardtack from Caleb's saddlebag, the last of the coffee from a small tin flask, and Eliza was calculating time and distance in her head when Caleb went suddenly still. She followed his gaze. 3 riders on the far ridge, stationary, watching. They were too far away to identify. But they were not moving, and they were facing this direction, and there was no innocent explanation for 3 stationary riders on a ridge above a trail that had no town at its end and no ranch within 20 miles. "How long do you think?" Eliza said. Her voice came out even. "Since the high meadow, maybe. Could be longer." He hadn't looked away from the ridge. "Pike moved faster than I expected." "Can we outrun them?" "Not on this trail. It narrows a quarter-mile south, and they'd cut us off at the switchback." He thought for exactly 3 seconds. "There's an alternate route. Longer, rougher, adds half a day to the ride. Then we take it. It crosses Devil's Mesa." She knew the name. Everyone in the valley knew the name, a broad exposed shelf of rock above the timberline, where the summer lightning came in fast, and the trails were marked more by tradition than any clear path. Men had gotten lost on Devil's Mesa. A few hadn't come back. "You know the route," she said. "Well enough. Then we take it." She was already gathering her reins. He looked at her for a brief moment, not checking her resolve. She understood. Just taking note of it. They moved. The alternate trail was everything he had promised: rough, steep, in places, the kind of terrain that required constant attention from both horse and rider. Eliza gave the horse her full focus and let the physical demand of the riding crowd out everything else. This was something she had always been good at, reducing the world to what was immediately in front of her when the larger picture became too much to hold. They didn't talk for 2 hours. When they stopped to rest the horses on a flat section of the mesa trail, Caleb checked their back trail from a high point, while Eliza stood beside the horses and breathed. The view from up here was enormous. The whole valley spread out below, like a map of everything she had known. Silver Creek, a cluster of small dark shapes in the late afternoon sun, the canyon a dark slash to the north. Caleb came down from the high point, and his face had changed. "They're on the mesa trail," he said. "About 90 minutes behind." "How many now?" "5. She had thought 3. 5 was different. 5 was not a warning party. "Pike came himself," Caleb said. Eliza looked at Thomas's rifle in the saddle scabbard. She had cleaned it 2 days ago out of habit. She did that sometimes when she couldn't sleep, took the rifle apart, and put it back together in the dark, because it was something she could do correctly in a world that kept presenting her with things she couldn't control. "If they catch us with the evidence," she said. "They won't." "Caleb." She looked at him directly. "If they catch us, what happens?" He met her eyes. He didn't lie to her, which she had already begun to understand was one of his consistent qualities. "It won't look like what it is," he said. "It'll look like something that happened on a remote trail. Riding accident. Wrong footing in the dark. Something. Same as Thomas." "Then they don't catch us," she said. "No, ma'am, they don't." They rode. The mesa trail was treacherous in the failing light. The rock surface uneven, the drop on the eastern side close enough to feel without looking. Eliza kept her eyes forward and her weight balanced and her breathing steady, and she thought about the ledger page inside Thomas's Bible, tucked now into the inside pocket of Caleb's jacket, because they had agreed his horse was more sure-footed in the dark, and if only one of them made it through the mesa crossing, it needed to be him. She had handed it over without argument. He had looked at her when she did it, and something in his expression had shifted, not dramatically, but in the way that a door shifts when a key finally turns in it. Recognition of something. She hadn't named it. There wasn't time. The first shot came from behind them without warning, not close. 40 yards. 50, but close enough that Eliza's horse lurched sideways, and she caught it with her knees before the animal could go off the trail edge. She heard Caleb shout something, and then she was focused entirely on the horse, bringing it back under her and keeping them both on the 2-foot-wide section of trail that stood between them and the drop. "Ride." Caleb was beside her, already moving. "Don't look back. Ride." She rode. The shots didn't come again immediately. The pursuit was navigating the same treacherous trail, and firing from a moving horse on Devil's Mesa in the dark was a way to end up at the bottom of it. But the sound of them back there, the voices carrying across the rock, was enough. The far edge of the mesa came up faster than she expected. The trail dropped sharply into a stand of pine, and suddenly there was cover, real cover. And Caleb pulled up, and she pulled up beside him, and they sat in the dark under the trees, both horses blowing hard, and listened. The pursuit had slowed on the exposed section of the trail. She could hear them arguing, one voice louder than the others, urgent. She recognized the voice. Sheriff Amos Pike. "Spread out. Reed, take the south edge. Martinez, stay on the trail." A pause. "Don't let them off this mesa." Caleb leaned close to her ear. His voice was barely a sound. "There's a creek crossing 300 yards east. On the other side the trail splits. North Fork goes to the old Miller claim. South Fork runs down to the Telegraph Road." The Telegraph Road. The route to Pueblo. To the federal marshal. She understood immediately. "Which way will they expect us to go?" she whispered. "The faster way, south." "Then one of us goes north," she said, "and one of us goes south." He pulled back to look at her in the dark. Even in near darkness, she could see that he understood exactly what she was proposing and didn't like it. "No," he said quietly. "Caleb, if we both go south, they cut us off before we hit the Telegraph Road. If one of us leads them north, then the one going north is alone on a mountain trail with Pike and 5 armed deputies." "I know that. Miss Carter. I know that," she repeated, still quiet, still even. "But one of us has to get to Pueblo." You have the evidence. You know the marshal. You go south. She looked at him steadily. I can lead them north. I know these upper trails. Thomas and I rode them for 3 summers before he took the valley job. I know where the Miller claim sits, and I know the back way down the ridge that doesn't cross open ground. The sounds from the Mesa Trail were getting closer. No more time. You said I wasn't helpless, she told him. You said it at the table in my kitchen, and I believed you meant it. Prove you meant it. A long second. 2, 3. The Miller claim has a root cellar, he said. East side of the main cabin doors under the tarp with the rusted weight on it. You get in there and you stay down until morning. All right. I'll come back for you. I know. She believed him. The certainty of it surprised her. She had not been in the habit of believing that statement from anyone. But she believed Caleb Rowan when he said it without knowing exactly when she had started to. Go, she said. He went. She counted to 10. Listening to his horse moving south through the pines, soft and careful on the needle-covered ground. Then she turned her own horse north, and she came out of the tree cover at a controlled trot, and she made just enough noise to be heard. The voices from the mesa shifted immediately. There north, she's going north. Good. She let the horse out a little and rode into the dark, and the sounds of pursuit came with her, and Caleb Rowan rode south toward the telegraph road with the ledger page and the receipt and the piece of fence post wood inside his jacket, carrying the truth toward the man who could do something with it. She had not saved herself by sitting at the empty table at the church picnic. She had not saved herself by riding up the mountain trail in the dark, or packing Thomas's rifle and her mother's photograph and leaving without looking back at the fire. She had also not needed saving, which was a different thing. She rode north into the dark, and she was afraid the way any person with sense is afraid when there are 5 armed men behind them on a mountain trail, and the moon is small, and the ground is uncertain. But fear did not mean stopped. Fear meant paying attention. She paid attention. She knew exactly where the Miller claim sat. She knew exactly where the root cellar door was, and she knew with a certainty that lived somewhere deeper than thought that Caleb Rowan was going to reach that telegraph road. She held that knowledge tight as a stone in a closed fist, and she rode, and the dark mountain closed around her. And behind her, she could hear Amos Pike still shouting orders into the summer night, his voice getting angrier as the distance between them grew, and she thought of Thomas, of his careful handwriting in those small notebooks, of the way he had believed that keeping good records was a form of protection. He had been right. He had just needed someone to find them. She kept riding. The root cellar smelled of earth and old potatoes, and the particular cold that lives underground even in the middle of August. Eliza had found the door exactly where Caleb said it would be, east side of the Miller cabin tarp, weighted with a rusted iron block, the hinges stiff from a season of disuse. She had gotten the horse into the cabin itself, which had taken 3 minutes of patient, quiet coaxing in the dark, and then she had dropped into the cellar and pulled the door shut over her head, and sat in the absolute black with her back against the earthen wall and Thomas's rifle across her knees, and listened to the sound of riders passing on the trail above. They passed twice. The second time, one of them stopped directly above her. She could hear the horse breathing. She could hear the creak of saddle leather as the rider shifted his weight. She pressed her back harder against the earth wall and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth in the slow, controlled way she had taught herself years ago, when the world required stillness from her, and stillness did not come naturally. The rider moved on. She stayed in the cellar until the first gray light came through the gap at the hinge side of the door. Then she came up slow and careful, checked the cabin, checked the trail in both directions, and stood in the early morning quiet with her jaw set and her heart rate returning to something manageable. Caleb had said he would come back. She believed him. What she had not calculated was how long back meant, or what might happen between now and then, or whether 5 armed men and an angry sheriff could stop a single determined mountain cowboy on a trail he knew better than any of them. She told herself he had made it to the telegraph road. She told herself this the way you tell yourself. Necessary things, not because the evidence is conclusive, but because the alternative is not a place you can afford to go while you still need to function. She watered the horse from the creek behind the cabin, and ate the last of the hardtack from her saddlebag, and sat on the cabin step, and watched the morning come in, and waited. He came over the north ridge at mid-morning alone, and moving fast. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. He rode straight to the cabin and dismounted in a single motion that had no wasted effort in it. And he looked at her, one complete assessing look, top to bottom, and something in his face relaxed by a degree she suspected he wasn't aware of. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right." She looked him over in turn. There was a dark stain on the left side of his jacket below the ribs, not large but unmistakable. "You're not." He looked down at it like he had momentarily forgotten. "It's a graze. Went past more than through." "Let me see it." "We don't have time to, Caleb." She said his name the way she had learned to say things that were not negotiable, quietly, without inflection, in a tone that made argument feel like more energy than it was worth. "Let me see it." He let her see it. It was a graze in the technical sense, which meant the bullet had not buried itself in him, which was the most favorable interpretation of a wound that had still opened a 4-inch channel through the skin and muscle along his left side, and bled considerably more than he was letting on. She cleaned it with water from the creek and wrapped it tight with strips cut from the cabin's single remaining curtain-rotted cotton. But better than nothing, and worked with the quick, precise hands of a woman who had been sewing and mending things since she was old enough to hold a needle. "The telegraph," she said while she worked. "Did you reach it?" "I reached it. Message went out to the Pueblo Marshal's office last night." He pulled in a careful breath as she tied off the bandage. "Mercer will have it by now." "How long before he can get here?" "He'll ride hard if he takes it seriously. 2 days, maybe 3. 2 days, 3 days. With Pike and 5 deputies still on the mountain, and a sheriff who had already burned a woman's house and shot at a man on a dark trail. He'll take it seriously," Eliza said. She sat back on her heels. "He has to." "He will." Caleb looked down at the bandage, and then at her. "That's good work." "Thomas used to cut himself on machinery. I had practice." She stood. "We need to move." "We do." Pike pulled his men off the Mesa Trail before dawn. I watched them go down. He'll regroup in town and think about what comes next. He was already calculating. She could see it in the set of his eyes. "He knows we sent word." The telegraph operator in Creek Falls couldn't have kept that quiet even if he wanted to. "Pike knows a marshal is coming." "So what does he do?" "He has 2 options. He waits for Mercer and tries to manage the narrative claims where fugitives, fabricates a story, gets Langley to back it. Or he stopped. Eliza looked at him. "Or he makes sure there's no one left to contradict his version before the marshal arrives," she said. "Yes." They looked at each other across the small space of the cabin. "Then we don't give him 2 days," Eliza said. "We go down. Down into Silver Creek. Not to hide, not to run." She picked up Thomas's rifle and checked the load with practiced hands. "We go down, and we make this public, in front of people. In the open, where it's harder to make things disappear quietly." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant risk, Miss Carter. I know what it is." She met his eyes. "But I've been thinking about something you said. About how Pike has 2 options. Well, so do we. We can stay up here and hope Mercer comes in time and stay alive maybe, but stay invisible. Or we go down and make this into something too visible to kill quietly." She paused. "My brother was killed because nobody saw it happen. I want to make sure that whatever happens next, everybody sees it." The silence stretched between them for 3 full seconds. Then Caleb reached for his hat and put it on. "Then we go down," he said. They came off the mountain by midday, and the heat of the valley floor hit like a wall after the high country air. Silver Creek sat quiet in the afternoon, the main street nearly empty in the worst of the summer heat. The kind of stillness that towns wear when something is wrong, and nobody wants to be the person standing outside when it becomes visible. Word had moved ahead of them. It always did in small towns. Eliza could feel it the moment they rode down the main street, the way curtains shifted at windows, the way the 2 men outside the feed store straightened up and then looked at each other and looked away. She rode straight and easy in the saddle, the rifle in the scabbard, and Thomas's Bible in her coat. And she did not look at the curtains or the men. She looked at the bank. Victor Langley was standing in the doorway of the Silver Creek Savings and Trust. His silver hair caught the afternoon light, He wore his good jacket. He had the expression of a man who has placed all his pieces on the board and is waiting for his opponent to realize the game is already over. He had not yet seen the expression on Eliza Carter's face. Caleb pulled up beside her. "Pike's office is down the south end. He'll have seen us come in." "Good." She dismounted. "I want him to see us." She tied her horse at the post in front of the bank and walked to the center of the street and turned so that she was facing in both directions. Langley to the east, the sheriff's office to the west. And she waited. It took 3 minutes. The first person out was Deputy Samuel Reed, who was 24 years old and had the unhappy face of a young man discovering that the job he had wanted was not the job he had taken. He came out of the sheriff's office with his hand resting on his holster, but not on the gun itself, which Eliza noted. "Miss Carter," he said. "Sheriff says you need to come in for questioning." "That's fine," she said. "He can question me right here." Reed stopped. "Miss Carter," "I said right here, Deputy, where the whole street can hear." She raised her voice just enough, not shouting, just carrying. Clear. "I've got evidence that Thomas Carter did not steal the miners' fund. I've got evidence that the money was taken by Victor Langley with Sheriff Pike's knowledge and cooperation. And I'd like the people of Silver Creek to hear that before anyone puts me in a room where they can decide what story gets told about what happened next." Curtains were moving all along the street. Doors were opening. Reed's hand had come off the holster. He was young, and he was looking at Eliza with an expression she recognized, the look of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has just been offered permission to set it down. He knew Thomas. She had told Caleb that on the mountain trail, and she had filed it away as something that might matter. It was about to matter now. Victor Langley came off the bank steps. He moved briskly, with the confidence of a man who had handled difficult public situations before and considered himself good at it. "This woman is making slanderous accusations against respected members of this community," he said loudly and clearly, for the benefit of the windows and the open doors. "She is in a state of grief and is not thinking clearly. Someone should help her inside." "Nobody is helping me inside anything," Eliza said. "Miss Carter, your brother stole from working men. The whole town knows. The whole town knows what you told them." She turned to face him fully. "The whole town knows the story you made up. But I have Thomas's name here in his own handwriting on a ledger page that matches the fund records, and I have your initials beside withdrawals that were never authorized." She reached into her coat pocket. "And I have a receipt with the blood of a man who was murdered on that canyon ledge, and a federal marshal on his way from Pueblo, who will be very interested to see all of it." Langley's face did not change. Practiced men don't let their faces change when they're frightened. But his eyes did. And Samuel Reed saw it. Eliza saw Reed see it. "Deputy." She turned to the young man directly. "You knew Thomas. He fixed your watch. Summer before last, the mainspring. He wouldn't take payment for it." Reed's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Thomas told me about that. He said you were a decent young man. He said that a lot about a lot of people in this valley who deserved better than what they were being given." She paused. "You've been carrying something. I don't know exactly what you've seen or what you've been told to look away from. But I'm asking you now in front of every person on this street who's watching from behind their curtains, whether the man who fixed your watch without taking a dime deserves the truth or deserves what they gave him." Reed stood very still. 10 seconds. 15. Then the sheriff's voice came from the direction of the office, hard and carrying, "Reed, get her inside, now." And Samuel Reed did not move. He stood exactly where he was, and he looked at Eliza Carter, and he said, "I need to see that ledger page, Miss Carter." Langley took 2 fast steps toward her. Caleb was there between them before Eliza had processed the movement, simply there, solid and immovable, without drama or announcement, standing between Eliza and the banker, with his full height and the particular stillness of a man who does not need to threaten because his presence is itself sufficient. "I wouldn't," Caleb said. Langley stopped. His composure cracked, not completely, not visibly to anyone who wasn't watching closely, but Eliza was watching closely. She saw the calculation behind his eyes shift from management to something more desperate. "You're interfering with a legal matter," Langley said. You're harboring a woman under suspicion. I'm standing on a public street in the middle of the afternoon, Caleb said. So is everyone else. By now, there were people on the sidewalks. Not many, not yet 7-8, watching from their doorways with the careful attention of people who haven't decided yet whether this is something they want to be part of. Eliza did not give them time to decide against it. She took the ledger page from the Bible and held it up. These are withdrawals from the Miners' Relief Fund, she said, not performing it, just saying it clearly and directly, the way Thomas used to read numbers aloud when he was checking his work. 11 entries between March and July of this year, each one marked as an authorized disbursement, each one initialed VL. She turned so that the people on the sidewalk could see the page, even if they couldn't read the figures from that distance. Thomas found these discrepancies. He was going to report them, and he was killed before he could. Pike came out of the sheriff's office. He came without hurrying, which was how Pike always moved when he wanted to appear in control, and he came with his hand resting on his gun, which was how Pike moved when he wanted to remind people what control looked like. He was flanked by 2 deputies, not Reed, who was still standing motionless in the middle of the street. Eliza Carter, Pike said. You're under arrest for what, Sheriff? Her voice cut him off cleanly. For possessing evidence, for requesting a federal investigation. She kept her voice level, but it carried. I sent word to Marshal Mercer 2 nights ago. He knows everything I know. Arresting me now doesn't change what he's already received. Pike stopped advancing. It was a small hesitation, a second no more. But the people on the sidewalk saw it. Clara Hennessy, who had spoken to Eliza at the picnic, was standing in the doorway of the dry goods store. Her husband had lost $40. She was watching Amos Pike hesitate, and her face was doing something complicated. I want to see those papers, a man's voice said. Eliza turned. It was George Dutton, the owner of the mine, 60 years old, a man with more money than Pike, and more community standing than Langley, and who had said nothing publicly since Thomas's death. He stepped off the sidewalk and crossed to the center of the street with the slow deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and has no intention of revisiting it. I want to see those papers, he said again to Eliza directly. Mr. Dutton, Langley began. Shut up, Victor. Dutton didn't even look at him. He looked at Eliza. My men lost their savings. I had the money in that fund for emergencies, so my workers wouldn't be ruined if the mine hit a bad season. That was real money that belonged to real men. He stopped in front of her. Show me. She showed him. He looked at the ledger page for a long time. He looked at the receipt. He looked at the piece of fence post with the bullet hole which Caleb produced from his inside jacket pocket without being asked. Dutton looked up at Victor Langley. And Victor Langley, for the first time in 20 years of running the bank and the valley and the people in it, looked away first. Amos, Dutton said without raising his voice. Put your hand away from that gun. Pike's hand moved away from the gun. The power of it was not theatrical. That was what made it real. George Dutton was not a hero. He was a practical man, a businessman, a person who had looked at the evidence in front of him and made the calculation that a federal marshal was coming, and the side of the evidence was the only side worth being on. But in this moment, in this street, his practical decision had the weight of something moral, and the people on the sidewalks felt it. Langley's composure finished collapsing. It happened in stages. First, the eyes, something behind them, giving way. Then a small involuntary movement of his hands, like a man reaching for something to hold on to and finding nothing. Then he turned, and he walked back toward the bank, and the movement had the unmistakable quality of a man who has no plan, who has never truly had a plan, beyond the belief that his own authority would always be sufficient. He had taken 3 steps when Samuel Reed said, "Mr. Langley." Langley stopped. Reed had moved while everyone was watching Dutton and Pike. While the street was holding its breath, the young deputy had positioned himself between Langley and the bank door. He stood there with his hands at his sides, and his deputy's star catching the afternoon sun, and the expression of a person who has decided something they will have to live with for the rest of their life, and has decided to live with it well. "I need you to stay here," Reed said. "Sir." Langley stared at him. "Samuel," he said, and his voice had lost its polish, entirely stripped down to something raw and uncertain. You don't want to do this. No, sir, Reed said. I don't particularly want to, but I'm going to. He looked at Eliza briefly, just a glance, but what it contained was significant, and then back at Langley. I heard you and the sheriff the night Thomas Carter died. I was in the back office. I didn't. He stopped, started again. I didn't understand what I was hearing until later, and then I told myself it wasn't what it seemed. His jaw tightened. It was what it seemed. The street was absolutely silent. Langley made his move then, not toward Reed, but sideways toward the gap between the bank and the adjacent building, a quick lateral step that had a younger man's urgency behind it. Caleb moved the same instant. He caught Langley by the coat sleeve. Not violently, not with any excessive force, simply with the inescapable grip of a man who has spent his adult life hauling cattle in a mountain summer camp and has no difficulty at all holding one silver-haired banker in place on a public street. Langley pulled. Caleb held. Let go of me. You have no right. Stay still, Caleb said. Quiet. Final. Langley stayed still, and then something happened that none of them had planned for, that no one standing on that street could have manufactured if they'd tried. Martha Eldon walked off the sidewalk. Martha Eldon, who had moved her basket 6 feet away from Eliza at the church picnic, who had started the rearrangement that all the other families followed. She walked into the center of the street and stood beside George Dutton and looked at the ledger page in his hand, and then she looked at Eliza, and her face was carrying the full, complicated weight of a woman who knows she has done something wrong and is deciding how to carry that knowledge. My husband works the Dutton mine, she said, quiet and direct to no one in particular and everyone at once. He had money in that fund. She paused. Thomas Carter helped him fill out the enrollment form, sat at our kitchen table and helped him. Wouldn't take dinner, said he'd already eaten. She looked at the ledger page. He was just a boy trying to do right. Eliza felt something in her chest crack open. Not grief. Not exactly. Something older and more complicated. The feeling of a verdict being reconsidered, of a record being corrected of the world, taking one lurching step back toward the shape it should have had all along. She did not cry. She had not cried since the morning after they found Thomas, and she did not cry now. But she looked at Martha Eldon, and she nodded once, and Martha Eldon nodded back, and between the two of them, that small exchange contained more than either of them could have put into words. Pike had not moved. He stood in the middle of the street with his 2 deputies behind him and the full exposure of the afternoon sun above him, and every choice he had was worse than the one before it. He could arrest Eliza and create a scene that half the town was already watching. He could draw a weapon and face Caleb Rowan and George Dutton and a deputy who had just switched sides. He could run and find out how far a corrupt sheriff on horseback gets before a federal marshal's warrant overtakes him. He stood. He calculated. And then the sound came from the north end of the street, hoofbeats, more than one horse moving at a pace that said purpose rather than ordinary travel. Everyone on the street turned. 4 riders came down the main street of Silver Creek in the full brightness of the afternoon, and the lead rider wore a badge that caught the light differently than a county deputy's star, and his name was Marshal Daniel Mercer, and he had made the Pueblo ride in a day and a half. He had not waited. Eliza looked at Caleb. Caleb was already looking at her. He had told her Mercer didn't bend. He had said it on the mountain trail, with the certainty of a man offering the best thing he had, knowing it might not be enough. She had taken it on faith. She understood now that she had been right to. Mercer pulled up in front of the group with the efficient calm of a man who has ridden into difficult situations before and has learned that the first 2 minutes of arrival tell him most of what he needs to know. He looked at Pike. He looked at Langley, still held by Caleb's grip. He looked at the ledger page in Dutton's hands. He looked at Reed standing between Langley and the bank door, with his deputy's star on and his hands at his sides. Then he looked at Eliza. "Miss Carter," he said. "Yes, sir. I understand you have evidence pertaining to a federal matter." "I do. I'll need to see all of it." He dismounted and handed his reins to one of the deputies behind him without looking away from her. "And I'll need a full account of events, starting with the night Thomas Carter died." "I can give you that," she said. She took the Bible from her coat. She opened the cover. The ledger page, the receipt, the piece of fence post wood, all of it still there, exactly as she had placed it, the morning of the fire, when the world she had known was burning, and she had taken the evidence and the rifle and her mother's photograph and left without looking back. She placed it all in Marshall Mercer's hands. Pike moved. A single step, not toward Mercer, not toward Eliza. Just a small automatic movement of a man whose body had decided to attempt something his mind hadn't yet approved. Mercer didn't look at him. "Don't," he said. Pike stopped. Reed unhooked his handcuffs from his belt. He looked at them for a moment, the way you look at a thing that represents a point of no return. Then he looked at Pike with the clear-eyed steadiness of a young man who had made the choice he was going to have to make, and had made it, and was done being afraid of it. "Sheriff Pike," he said, "I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back." The silence on that street was complete. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The summer heat pressed down, and the afternoon light lay flat and gold across the dust. And for one long moment, Silver Creek held itself perfectly still, like a breath drawn in before something irrevocable happens. Amos Pike looked at Samuel Reed for a long time. Then he put his hands behind his back. Eliza watched Reed put the handcuffs on Pike's wrists, and she thought of Thomas at their kitchen table with his notebooks and his careful columns of numbers, believing that keeping accurate records was a form of protection for people who had no other protection. He had been right. He had been so precisely, absolutely right, and it had cost him everything. And now here was his work, his actual work, his handwriting, his careful notation of things that were wrong, sitting in a federal marshal's hands in the middle of the town that had tried to bury it. Caleb came to stand beside her. Not close, a respectful distance, the distance of a man who understands that certain moments belong entirely to the person living them. But near enough that she was aware of him, near enough that the steadiness he carried in everything he did was available to lean on if she needed it. She didn't need it, but she was glad it was there. "It's done," he said very quietly. "Not yet," she said. "Almost." She looked at Victor Langley, still standing where Caleb had held him now, with Mercer's second deputy at his elbow, the silver-haired banker who had sat across from her at the church picnic and told her to go home, who had stood in the afternoon light like a pillar of the community while her brother was 6 days in the ground. "Almost," she said again, and she turned to watch Marshall Mercer begin to read the ledger page with the same focused attention that Thomas had brought to everything he ever read. And she stood in the middle of the street in Silver Creek under the full summer sun, and she did not look away from any of it. Marshal Daniel Mercer was not a man who did things halfway. By sundown of that first day, he had commandeered the sheriff's office and turned it into a working investigation room with Pike's own desk cleared of its ordinary contents and replaced with the ledger page, the receipt, the piece of fence post wood, and every document that Mercer's deputies had pulled from the bank in the first 2 hours after Langley's wrists went into irons. He had sent one rider back to Pueblo for a second marshal and a territorial judge. He had posted his own men at the bank doors and the jail and the telegraph office, and he had made it quietly, efficiently clear that Silver Creek was operating under federal oversight until further notice. Eliza sat across from him in that office for 2.5 hours. She told him everything in the order. It happened without embellishment and without apology, the way Thomas used to account for things clean and sequential, beginning to end. Mercer listened without interrupting, which was a quality she was beginning to recognize in men worth trusting. He asked 3 questions, each precise, and targeted, each revealing that he had absorbed every word she said and was working with it in real time. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your brother kept notebooks," he said. "You mentioned that. Personal notebooks separate from the fund records. Always, since he was a boy. Do you know what happened to them?" She had thought about this on the mountain trail, and again in the root cellar, and again every quiet moment since. "He kept them at the boarding house, Mrs. Hale's, on the north side of town. He had a room there." Mercer was already on his feet. "Deputy Calloway." The deputy appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Hale's boarding house, north side. Ask for access to the Carter room. If she hesitates, show her the federal authorization." He turned back to Eliza. "You should come." They walked through Silver Creek in the early evening. Mercer and two deputies and Eliza and the town watched them go with the particular quality of attention that a community gives to something it knows is important and is still deciding how to feel about. Doors were open in the summer heat. People stood on their steps. Nobody called out, but nobody turned away either. Mrs. Hale was a small woman with gray hair and a backbone like iron, and she opened the door before they knocked, which meant she had been watching the street. She looked at Eliza for a long moment. "I kept his room," she said. Her voice was even, but something moved behind her eyes, the careful, controlled guilt of a person who had believed what everyone believed and was now standing at the edge of understanding what that belief had cost. "I didn't let anyone in. Something felt wrong from the start. She stopped. "Come in." Thomas's room was small and orderly. The bed was made with the hospital corners that Mrs. Hale enforced, but everything else was. Thomas, the small stack of engineering books on the window ledge, the pen and ink holder on the desk, the row of 7 small notebooks lined up on the shelf above the desk, with the precision of a person who understands that order is a form of safety. Eliza stood in the doorway and could not for a moment go further. Caleb put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Light. There and then, not there, like a question that didn't require an answer. She went in. Mercer took the notebooks from the shelf with careful hands and opened the most recent one on the desk. He read in silence for 3 minutes. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but something in his posture shifted, a settling, a consolidation. The look of a man who has found what he was hoping to find and is now thinking about what it changes. "Miss Carter," he said. She came to the desk. The notebook was open to an entry dated 12 days before Thomas's death. His handwriting was small and precise, and exactly as she remembered it, the way he had always written, as if the paper were valuable and shouldn't be wasted. She read the entry once, then again. Thomas had not just suspected, he had known. He had traced the withdrawals across 4 months of fund records, cross-referenced them against the bank's public deposit reports, and identified a systematic pattern of falsified disbursements totaling nearly $4,000. He had written in his careful accountant's hand the full names of the individuals he believed responsible, Victor Langley and Amos Pike, and the date on which he intended to bring his findings to the Territorial Land Office rather than the local authorities, because he had written in his neat, quiet way that he did not trust the local authorities. He had planned to go the following Thursday. He was dead by Tuesday. Eliza stood very still. 2 days. He had been 2 days from being safe, and he hadn't known it, and there was nothing she could do with that information except hold it and accept it as the particular cruelty that it was. "I was going to the right people," Mercer said. He said it quietly and without preamble because he could see what she was looking at, and he was not a man who wasted words on comfort that didn't serve. He had this, all of this. Any territorial judge would have opened an investigation on this evidence alone. "I know," she said. He knew how to protect himself. He just didn't know how little time he had. "I know that too." She closed the notebook. She picked it up, all 7 of them, one after another, and she held them against her chest for a moment before she put them on the desk beside Mercer. "Take them. Take all of it. Make sure it counts for something." "It will," Mercer said. He looked at her directly when he said it, not with the softness of a man offering consolation, but with the flat certainty of a man making a professional commitment. And she believed him the same way she had believed Caleb when he said he would come back. Some people carried their word in a way you could feel. She was getting better at recognizing them. The lockbox was found the following morning. One of Mercer's deputies had spent the night going through the bank floor by floor, a systematic process that the territorial authorization made possible and Langley's frantic denials made necessary. It was not hidden with particular genius. A portion of the floorboards in the back storage room of the bank had been replaced more recently than the others, the wood slightly cleaner, the nails not yet fully darkened with age. A man who knew what he was looking for found it in 40 minutes. The lockbox contained $4,260 in cash, a second set of fund ledgers in Langley's handwriting that matched Thomas's reconstructed version almost precisely, and a single letter from Pike to Langley, dated 3 weeks before Thomas's death, containing 7 words in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable paragraph that would have meant nothing to anyone who didn't know what to look for. The bookkeeper is asking inconvenient questions. thoughts, and below it in Langley's reply, copied in Langley's own hand on the back of the page, in the way that careful, arrogant men sometimes preserve their own correspondence. Some questions are better answered before they're asked. Mercer read both letters at the desk in the sheriff's office, while Eliza sat across from him, and when he looked up, his face was carrying the expression of a man who has found the thing that closes the door completely. "That's intent," he said. "Documented in their own handwriting." "Yes," Eliza said. "Pike and Langley are looking at federal charges, fraud, conspiracy, and depending on how the territorial prosecutor handles the Canyon evidence." He paused. "There are men in Pueblo who are very good at building a murder case from circumstantial evidence when the circumstantial evidence is this consistent." She absorbed that murder case against the men who had put her brother in the ground and then spent 6 days making her sit at an empty table. "How long?" she said. "The legal process, months possibly. A full trial." "I know a trial takes time. I mean—" She stopped, found the right words. "How long before Thomas's name is formally cleared? Before there's something on record that says he didn't steal anything, that he didn't run, that he was—" She stopped again. "The fund records restoration can happen quickly," Mercer said. "Within days. I'll make sure the formal exoneration is part of the first territorial filing." He held her gaze. "Your brother's name will be cleared, Miss Carter. I give you my word on that." She nodded. She had learned in the past 4 days that there was a difference between justice and the feeling she had imagined justice would produce. She had expected something larger, some seismic shift in the interior, some resolution of the tight, constant ache she had been carrying since the morning they brought Thomas up from the canyon. What she found instead was something quieter. Not peace, not yet. But the particular stillness that comes when something that has been wrong for a long time begins. Finally, the slow process of being made right. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, a great deal. The miners came on the 3rd day. There were 14 of them, men from the Dutton operation and the 2 smaller claims north of town, and they came to the bank in the morning where Mercer's deputies were cataloging the recovered funds, and they stood in a line on the sidewalk with their hats in their hands. Their spokesman was a man named Garrett Broad, weathered a decade of mine work written in the set of his shoulders, and he asked to speak to the woman who had found the money. Eliza came out. Garrett looked at her for a moment with the careful expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is deciding whether to use the rehearsed version or say the real thing instead. He said the real thing. "My wife was going to take in laundry," he said, "to make up the $40 we lost. She's got a bad back, and she was going to take in other people's laundry because we had nothing put by." He stopped. "We got 3 children." He turned his hat over in his hands once. "Miss Carter, I don't know how to say sorry for what this town did to you. I don't know if sorry covers it, but I want you to know that I know what your brother was, and I know what you are, and I know the difference between those things and what we treated you like." Eliza looked at him. She thought about what to say. She had turned it over in her mind, the way you turn a difficult problem, considering angles, testing weight. She had thought about making it easier for them, about the kind of grace that smoothed things over and lets everyone return to ordinary life without too much residual discomfort. She had always been good at making things easier for other people. She decided against it. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "I appreciate what you're saying. I do. And your wife will not need to take in laundry. Mr. Mercer has told me the funds will be restored within the week." She paused. "But I want to say one thing, and I want to say it plainly because I think it matters." She looked at him and then past him at the other men in the line and at the people who had drifted to the edges of the sidewalk to listen. Silence helped those 2 men more than any gun ever could. They relied on it. They counted on it. The reason Thomas is dead, one of the reasons, not the only one, is that this community decided what kind of people my family was before anyone asked a single question, and then it stayed quiet and let that decision stand. She held Garrett's gaze. "I'm not asking for apologies. I'm asking every person in this valley to remember what silence costs. Because the next Thomas Carter might not be lucky enough to leave notebooks." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Garrett put his hat back on his head. "Yes, ma'am," he said. It was not much, but it was genuine, and genuine was what she had asked for. The part she hadn't anticipated was Martha Eldon. Martha came to where Eliza was staying, the room that Mrs. Hale had offered her above the boarding house, the only formal offer of shelter she'd received, and she had taken it because the alternative was a burned foundation and a horse tied to a fence post. She came on the afternoon of the third day after Garrett and his men, after Mercer's second round of questioning, after the news spread through town that the lockbox had been found and the full amount recovered. She knocked. She waited. Eliza opened the door. Martha was carrying a covered dish. Not a pie, a pot of something warm beans and salt pork, by the smell of it. Practical. The kind of thing you bring to someone who needs to eat rather than someone you are performing generosity toward. "I'm not here to make myself feel better," Martha said before Eliza could say anything. "I need you to know that. I'm not here so I can go home and think I made it right." She held out the dish. "There isn't a way to make it right, I know that, but you should eat something real." Eliza took the dish. She stood in the doorway, and she looked at this woman who had started the rearrangement at the church picnic, who had set in motion the sequence of turned backs and moved baskets that had defined the 6 days between Thomas's death and the afternoon Caleb Rowan sat down beside her. "Come in," Eliza said. Martha came in. She sat at the small table near the window. She did not take her hat off, which meant she was not planning to stay long, which meant she had respected Eliza enough not to assume the invitation was unlimited. "I followed," Martha said. "That's the truth of it. Robert, my husband, moved down the table first, and I followed because I didn't want to be the person who stayed." She looked at her hands. "That's a cowardly reason, and I know it." "It is," Eliza agreed. Martha looked up, surprised maybe by the directness. Then something in her face settled. "I've been thinking about what you said in the street, about silence." "Good." "I've been thinking about it for 3 days and not sleeping much." "Also good," Eliza said, and then because she was not a cruel woman, even when she was a direct one. "Not because I want you to suffer, but because thinking about it is how it changes something." Martha nodded slowly. "Is there anything—" She stopped, started again. "Is there anything I can do?" "Practically. I mean practically not. I know what you mean." Eliza set the dish on the sideboard. "I'm going to need somewhere to operate from. A space. I've been thinking about a shop sewing and supplies, something that serves the workers coming through and the women in the valley who don't have much recourse when things go wrong." She looked at Martha evenly. "I'll need people who know this town to tell others it's worth trusting, that the woman running it is worth trusting." Martha held her gaze for 3 full seconds. "I can do that," she said. "Then we understand each other." Martha left shortly after. At the door, she paused, and she turned, and she said, not performing it at all, just saying it plainly. "He was a good young man, your brother. Whatever I thought, I always knew that underneath it. I should have held on to it harder." Eliza looked at her. "Yes," she said. "You should have." The door closed. She sat down at the table, and she let the quiet of the room hold her for a moment. Outside, she could hear the ordinary sounds of Silver Creek rearranging itself around a new shape of things. Voices, a wagon on the street, someone calling across to a neighbor. The world continuing the way it always did, slightly altered but fundamentally the same, and the task of every person in it to decide what to do with the alteration. She heard boots on the stairs, not hurried. Familiar now, the particular unhurried steadiness of a man who did not move faster than he needed to because he had never needed to prove anything by his speed. Caleb knocked. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood near the door with his hat in his hands, which she had noticed was how he stood when he was being careful about something. He had changed out of the jacket with the blood-stained side Mrs. Hale had apparently insisted on, that which Eliza approved of, and his arm was moving more freely than it had been yesterday, which meant the wound was behaving. "Mercer wants to see you again tomorrow morning," he said. "Formal statement. The territorial filing. I know. He sent word." He nodded. He stayed where he was. There was something in the room, not uncomfortable, but significant. The particular quality of air between two people who have been through something together and are now standing on the near side of it, and haven't yet determined what the near side looks like or what it means for the space between them. You should go back up to the camp, she said. He looked at her. The cattle, she said. You've been away from the camp for days. Summer grazing, you said. That doesn't run itself. No, it doesn't, he agreed. He was still looking at her in that direct, unhurried way that she had gotten used to and was going to miss more than she currently wanted to acknowledge. I'll go up tomorrow, after Mercer's finished. You don't have to stay for that. I know I don't. She looked at him. Caleb, she said. You sat down beside me at a church picnic when every person in this valley had decided I was something to be avoided. You put evidence of a murder in your jacket and rode a mountain trail at night with men shooting at you. You sent a telegraph message to a federal marshal and rode back through enemy country to a root cellar where I might or might not have survived the night. She paused. You don't owe me anything more. You've given more than most people give in a lifetime. Howe was quiet for a moment. Miss Carter, he said, I didn't do any of those things because I owed you something. The room was warm and still. I know, she said quietly. Then you know why I'm staying until tomorrow. She did know. She had known it on the mountain trail when she handed him the ledger page, and he looked at her. The way he looked at her. She had known it in the root cellar in the dark holding Thomas's rifle, and telling herself Caleb was going to reach the telegraph road, and finding that she was certain of it in a way that had nothing to do with calculation. She had known it since a man with trail dust on his jacket had sat down beside her at an empty table and said, he didn't eat beside cowards, and meant every syllable. All right, she said. Stay until tomorrow. He nodded. He put his hat back on. I'll be downstairs if Mercer sends anyone, he said. Caleb. He stopped at the door. The preserves, she said. At the picnic. You said they were genuinely good. They were. I have another jar. I put it up in June before all of this. She looked at him evenly. If you come back down from the mountain sometime, not anytime soon, when the cattle are settled and the grazing's done and you've got a reason to come into town. She paused. I'll open the other jar. He looked at her for a moment. The corner of his mouth moved in that way she had catalogued early and thought about more than she intended to. I'll hold you to that, ma'am, he said. He went downstairs. Eliza sat at the table in the quiet room and outside the window. Silver Creek was doing what towns do, existing, adjusting, moving through the consequences of things that had happened and toward the shape of things that were going to happen. The burned foundation of her cabin was 2 miles down the road. Thomas's notebooks were in a federal marshal's custody. The lockbox was opened and the money returned, and the silence that had held all of it in place was broken finally and completely, and in front of enough witnesses that it could not be put back together. She thought about the shop. She thought about the widows and the workers and the travelers that Martha Eldon would tell people to trust. She thought about a space that was hers, built from what she knew how to do in a town that now owed her the right to exist in it on her own terms. She thought about a jar of blackberry preserves sitting on a shelf, waiting for a man who came down from the mountains on no particular schedule and always had a reason for being where he was, even when the reason was simpler than he made it sound. She thought about Thomas, his notebooks in Mercer's hands, his name going into the territorial record as cleared, exonerated, restored to what it always was. The name of a careful, decent young man who had believed that keeping good records was a form of protection and had been right about everything except how little time he had. She would carry that. She already knew she would carry it for the rest of her life. But carrying it and being crushed by it were different things, and she was very clear now on which one she was going to choose. She got up from the table. She washed her face at the basin. She went downstairs, and Caleb was at the table near the window, and Mrs. Hale was making noise in the kitchen and outside. The summer evening was coming in warm and golden over Silver Creek, and Eliza Mae Carter sat down at the table across from the man who had first sat down beside her, and she said, "Tell me about the mountain." And he told her. He told her about the mountain, the way he told her most things, without ornament, without performance, in the plain and specific language of a man who had spent 11 summers observing something closely enough to know its actual character rather than his idea of it. He told her about the way the cattle settled differently, at elevations slower to spook, as if the altitude removed some low-grade anxiety that valley living put in every living thing. He told her about the creek that ran east of the camp, cold even in August, fed from snowmelt that never fully stopped. He told her about the hawk that had been nesting on the rock face above the camp for 4 consecutive summers, which he had no scientific basis for believing was the same hawk each year, but chose to believe anyway, on the grounds that consistency deserved recognition wherever it appeared. Eliza listened. Mrs. Hale brought food from the kitchen without being asked, beans and cornbread and 2 cups of coffee, and set it between them and retreated without ceremony, because Mrs. Hale was a woman who understood the difference between a conversation that wanted company and one that didn't. "You've never thought about coming down permanently," Eliza said. "Getting a place in the valley?" Caleb considered the question. "I tried it once, 7 years ago. Took a winter room at the old Crest Hotel and told myself I'd see how it sat." He picked up his coffee. "Left by February. Too crowded. Too loud," he said. "Not in the physical sense, just—" He paused. "Everybody in a town is always telling a story about themselves. Who they are, what they've got, what they're worth. Up on the mountain, there's nothing to tell it to, so you stop." He looked at his cup. "Turns out, I like who I am when I've stopped telling the story." Eliza looked at him for a moment. "I think that might be the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years," she said. He looked up. "I'm going to start over," she said. It came out simply, without the weight of announcement she might have given it a week ago. "The shop. The building on the corner of 2nd and Mill. Mrs. Hale said the owner has had it empty for a year and is willing to discuss terms. Suing supplies alterations. Something that serves the people nobody else is particularly interested in serving." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Thomas always said the most reliable businesses were the ones that showed up for people who had nowhere else to go. How was right about that?" "He was right about a lot of things." She said it without flinching, which was new, the ability to say true things about Thomas without feeling the ground shift beneath her. "I'm going to put his name on the door. Not mine. His." She looked at Caleb steadily. "Carter Supply and Sewing. So that the first thing anyone sees when they walk past is his name on a building in the town that tried to erase it." Caleb set down his cup. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her at the church picnic table, that complete unguarded attention that had unsettled her then and did something different to her now. "That's a good thing," he said. "I know," she said. And she almost smiled the way she had almost smiled at the picnic over the blackberry preserves. Except this time, the almost resolved itself quietly and without fanfare into the real thing. Caleb Rowan looked at Eliza Carter, smiling across a supper table in the summer evening, and he felt something shift in the interior that he had spent 11 years keeping very carefully organized, and he recognized the shift for what it was and did not argue with it. He went up to the mountain the next morning. Mercer's formal statement took 2 hours. Eliza sat in the sheriff's office. Pike's desk. Pike's chair on the far side of it, now occupied by a federal marshal, which was a rearrangement she found privately satisfying, and she gave her account a second time, this time with a deputy recording it by hand in the precise formal language that territorial filings required. She added the detail about Thomas's warning to her 2 weeks before his death. She added Martha Eldon's testimony about Thomas sitting at the Eldon kitchen table, helping Robert Eldon fill out his fund enrollment form. She added Samuel Reed's account, which Mercer had already taken separately, of what Reed had overheard in the back office on the night Thomas died. When it was done, Mercer stamped the document and looked at her across the desk. "The exoneration filing goes to the Territorial Records Office in Denver by end of week," he said. "It will be public record. Anyone who pulls Thomas Carter's name from the Colorado Territorial Register from that point forward will find a formal declaration of wrongful accusation and posthumous exoneration." Eliza nodded. "There's one more thing," Mercer said. He reached into the file on the desk and produced a single sheet of paper. "The fund balance fully restored amounts to $4,260. The Miners Committee has asked that $30 be set aside as a formal payment to Thomas Carter's estate, his contribution to the recovery effort they're calling it." He slid the paper across the desk toward her. "You're his next of kin." She looked at the paper. $30. A formal payment from the Miners Committee to a young man who had spent 4 months of his life keeping careful records and had died for the accuracy of them. "He would have refused it," she said. "Probably," Mercer agreed. "But he can't, so it falls to you." He looked at her evenly. "Take it, Miss Carter. It's the Valley saying out loud what it knows." She took it. She folded it and put it inside Thomas's Bible, in the same place she had kept the ledger page and the receipt on the mountain trail. It seemed right that something from him should live there now. She walked out of the sheriff's office into the full August morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. The town was awake and moving around her. Wagons on the street, people going between the stores, the ordinary commerce of a summer morning. But the way people moved near her had changed. Not dramatically, this was Silver Creek, not a place given to dramatic reversals, but the small adjustments were gone, the slight angling away the eyes that found somewhere else to be. People met her gaze now. A woman she didn't know nodded from across the street. The man from the feed store, who had looked away the day she and Caleb rode in, held his hand up in a brief plain acknowledgement as she passed. It was not much. It was not nothing. Clara Hennessy caught up to her on the corner of 2nd and Mill. "Miss Carter." Clara was slightly out of breath, which meant she had been watching for her. I wasn't going to say anything, and then I decided that was exactly the wrong choice given everything." She stopped and looked at Eliza directly. "I spoke to you at the picnic. What I said to you." "I remember. I've thought about it every day since." Clara's jaw was set in the way of a woman who is embarrassed, but has decided to be embarrassed in public because it's the right thing. Robert lost his $40, and that was real, and I was angry. But I took that anger, and I put it on you, and I knew. I knew Thomas Carter. I knew what kind of young man he was, and I put it on you anyway, because it was easier than sitting with not knowing. She held Eliza's gaze. "That was wrong. It was wrong, and I knew it while I was doing it, and I did it anyway." Eliza looked at her. "Clara," she said, "you just described half of human nature." Clara blinked. "I'm not excusing it," Eliza said. "I'm saying I know why people do it. Fear is easier to point at someone than to hold by yourself." She paused. "Don't do it the next time. That's all I want. When the next person comes along who's being pointed at, don't follow the point." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Is that enough?" she said. "After everything." "It's what I'm asking for," Eliza said. "Whether it's enough is something you'll have to work out on your own." She left Clara on the corner and walked to the building at 2nd and Mill. It was a good-sized space, larger than she'd been imagining. Wide front windows, a sound floor, a back room that could serve as storage and workspace. The lock was stiff but functional. The previous tenant had left 2 long wooden counters pushed against the far wall, which was exactly what she needed and would have cost her money she didn't yet have to obtain otherwise. She stood in the center of the empty space, and she let herself see it. Really see it the way you see something when you are deciding to build your life in its direction. Carter Supply and Sewing. Thomas's name above the door. A place for people who had nowhere else to go. She was still standing there when the building's owner, a man named Aldous Price, who had 3 chins and a surprisingly gentle disposition, came to discuss terms. He had heard what had happened. Everyone in Silver Creek had heard, and he made her a reasonable offer with the unsentimental practicality of a man who recognized that being on the right side of something before it became fully established was simply good business. She negotiated him down, 7%, and shook his hand, and walked out with a 2-year lease, and the first decision she had made entirely on her own since Thomas died. She walked back to the boarding house, feeling like something that had been compressed for a very long time was very slowly, carefully beginning to expand. The trial was set for November. Mercer came to tell her in person, which she appreciated. He sat at the table in Mrs. Hale's kitchen. He had become a regular presence at that table over the 2 weeks since the arrest, which Mrs. Hale endured with the stoic pragmatism of a woman who understood that federal investigations required somewhere to drink coffee, and he laid out the territorial prosecutor's case with the same clean precision he applied to everything. Langley and Pike were both refusing to cooperate with each other, which Mercer said was exactly what you wanted from two men who had been partners in something that went badly wrong. Each of them was constructing a defense that required the other to bear the larger portion of responsibility, and in doing so, each of them was providing the prosecution with testimony it couldn't have obtained any other way. "The Canyon death," Eliza said. "Thomas." Mercer looked at her steadily. "The territorial prosecutor is charging both men with first-degree murder. The evidence from the notebooks, the letters from the lockbox Reed's testimony, and the physical evidence from the canyon site is sufficient to build the case." He paused. "I won't promise a conviction. Juries are juries, but the case is strong." "Will I need to testify?" "Possibly. I'll know more in September." She nodded. She had thought about this standing in a courtroom and saying Thomas's name in front of a judge and a jury, and whatever remained of Pike's and Langley's damaged authority. She had thought about it and had come to peace with it in the way she came to peace with difficult things, by deciding that the discomfort of it was a currency she was willing to spend. "Tell me when you know," she said. Reed came to see her the following day. He came in the afternoon off duty, without his star, which she thought was deliberate and correct. He was 24 years old, and he had the face of someone who had aged several years in the past 2 weeks and was still working out whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. She let him in. He stood near the door and said what he'd come to say without preamble, because she had come to understand that directness in young men was usually a sign of genuine remorse rather than its performance. "I heard Pike give the order," he said. "The night Thomas died. I heard him say that the bookkeeper needed to be handled before Thursday. I didn't know what that meant. I told myself I didn't know what that meant." He stopped. "That's the thing I have to carry. That I told myself a story about what I heard, because the alternative was something I wasn't ready to act on." Eliza looked at him. "You acted on it when it mattered," she said. "Not soon enough." "No," she agreed. "Not soon enough." She let that sit for a moment, not to be cruel, but because she had decided that the truth was worth more than everyone's comfort, including her own. "But you stood in the street with your handcuffs in your hands, and you made a choice that was going to cost you your job and your standing in this town, and possibly a great deal more, and you made it anyway." She paused. Thomas would have respected that. He believed in late better than never. Reed looked at her. "Did he?" he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "He fixed your watch," she said. "He didn't have to do that either." Reed looked down at the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, something in his face had settled, not resolved, not completed, but settled in the way that things settle when you've said the true thing out loud, and found that the world didn't end. "What happens to me now?" he said. "With the deputy position. With Mercer's investigation. Mercer told me your testimony is protected under the Federal Cooperation Agreement," she said. "Your job." She paused. "That's a county decision, and the county is in the middle of figuring out what it looks like without a corrupt sheriff. I don't know. But I'll tell anyone who asks that Samuel Reed is a decent young man who made a hard choice at personal risk, and this valley is better off with him in it." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Miss Carter." "Don't thank me," she said. "Just remember the next time you're in a back office, hearing something that doesn't sit right." He left. She sat down at Mrs. Hale's kitchen table and pressed both palms flat on the surface and breathed in and out twice, and she thought about Thomas at 22, the same age Reed was now near enough standing at the desk in his boarding house room with his notebooks and his careful figures, already hearing things that didn't sit right, already deciding to do something about them. The difference between Thomas and Samuel Reed was timing and outcome, and that difference was everything, and also, in some final accounting, nothing at all. Both of them had looked at a thing that was wrong and decided they were not willing to look away. That was what mattered. That was what Eliza held on to. The shop opened on the 15th of September. She had spent 3 weeks preparing it, cleaning, repairing, setting up the counters, ordering stock from the Denver supply house that took new accounts from Colorado Territory businesswomen without comment, which she noted approvingly. She had made a sign herself, pine board and black paint the letters even and clean, Carter Supply and Sewing. She had climbed a chair and hung it above the door herself, and she had stood back and looked at it for a long moment before she let herself feel what she felt. Thomas's name on a building in Silver Creek, permanent and visible and hers to maintain. Martha Eldon had been as good as her word. By the morning of the opening, 3 separate women had come by in the preceding days to ask about alterations and thread and whether she carried buttons in bone as well as shell. A miner's wife named Rosa had asked about the hours and whether Eliza would allow payment in installments when times were thin, to which Eliza had said yes without hesitation, because Thomas had always said the most important question a business could answer was whether it understood the people it served. Mrs. Hale came for the opening and stood in the doorway with her arms folded and examined everything with the critical attention of a woman who had been running a household business for 30 years and knew what she was looking at. "Good," she said finally. "The back room is sensibly organized. Most people don't get the back room right." Coming from Mrs. Hale, Eliza recognized this as high praise. George Dutton came in the afternoon. He brought his wife, who was a quiet woman with careful eyes, and she looked at the fabric samples and asked 3 intelligent questions about the sewing capacity and whether Eliza took custom work for larger orders. Dutton himself stood near the door and looked at the sign above it for a moment, and then looked at Eliza. "Good name," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Dutton. I mean it. It's the right name." He paused. "My workers' wives will be in. I'll make sure of it." He left without waiting for thanks, which was how Eliza was beginning to understand Dutton operated. He made decisions and then moved on without requiring acknowledgement, which was a quality she had a great deal of respect for. By evening, 6 customers. By the end of the first week, 14. By the end of September, Carter Supply and Sewing was covering its costs and beginning to build something above them. She wrote to her mother in Missouri. She had put it off the letter the whole conversation because there had been nothing to say for weeks that wasn't too large and too raw to put in writing. But now she had the words. She sat at the table in her room above Mrs. Hale's boarding house, and she wrote the whole truth beginning to end in the same plain and specific language she had given to Mercer. She told her mother what Thomas had found and what it had cost him. She told her about the exoneration and the trial and the name above the door. She told her that Thomas had been exactly who he always was, right up to the end, and that the end did not define him, and that Silver Creek now knew it. She did not soften it. Her mother deserved the truth the same way Thomas did. She sealed the letter and walked it to the post herself and stood at the box for a moment before she dropped it in. Then she walked back to the shop and unlocked the door and went in and lit the lamp and sat down at the work table and sewed until her hands were tired, which was a long time, because her hands were very good at what they did. Caleb came down from the mountain on the first Saturday of October. She heard his horse on the road before she saw him. She was at the front counter when the sound came, and she recognized it without having consciously learned to recognize it, which told her something she had already known. She didn't go to the window. She straightened the bolt of cloth she was measuring and waited. The bell above the door sounded. He came in with the hat already in his hands, which meant he had taken it off before he reached the door, which meant something. He looked at the shop, one complete taking it in. Look the way he looked at things. He wanted to understand fully, and then at the sign on the wall behind her, which she had made as well. Carter Supply and Sewing. Jones, 1884. He looked at it for a moment longer than everything else. "It's good," he said. "I know." She set down the cloth. "How are the cattle?" "Settled. The summer grazing went long, good grass year. I came down a week earlier than I planned." He looked at her steadily. "I had a reason to." The shop was empty. The afternoon light came through the front windows and lay across the counter between them, and neither of them moved for a moment. "You said you had another jar of preserves," he said. "I do. I brought coffee." He reached into the canvas bag at his side and produced a paper-wrapped parcel, good quality. Not the bitter camp variety. The kind that required a deliberate trip to a store that carried it. "Found it on the trail." She looked at him. He had said it the same way. He'd said found on the trail with the same quality of straight face that was not quite a straight face, and was one of the things she had been thinking about up here in the valley while he was up there on the mountain. "You found it," she said. "Came across it." Between your camp and Silver Creek. It was along the way, he said. She went to the back room and came back with the blackberry preserves and set them on the counter. He put the coffee beside them. They looked at the two things sitting together on the counter, the jar she had made in June with Thomas in the ordinary and possible world that had existed before everything changed, and the coffee he had found on the trail, and the simple rightness of the combination was not lost on either of them. "Stay for supper," she said. "I don't want to take up your evening." Caleb. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at things that were not negotiable. "Stay for supper." He stayed. Mrs. Hale fed them at the big kitchen table and took herself off to the parlor with a pointed discretion that Eliza appreciated. They ate and drank the good coffee and talked not about the case, not about Pike or Langley or the November trial that was still waiting on the calendar. They talked about the shop and the miner's wife named Rosa, who paid in installments and had begun bringing her daughter on Saturdays, and the way Silver Creek was slowly imperfectly with the particular stumbling quality of a community that has looked at itself honestly and not entirely liked what it found, beginning to become a different version of itself. They talked about Thomas. This was the part that surprised her. Not the talking itself, but how it felt. She had expected it to hurt the way it had been hurting, with that compressed internal quality of grief that makes the edges of things feel unstable. But sitting here with Caleb across the table saying Thomas's name, telling the story of the watch mainspring and the engineering books and the careful notebooks, it hurt in a cleaner way. The way a wound hurts when it is finally getting the air it needed. "He would have liked you," she said. Caleb considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. "On what basis?" "You don't tell stories about yourself," she said. Thomas had very little patience for men who told stories about themselves. A pause. "I liked him," Caleb said. "From what you've told me." "He was worth liking." She looked at her coffee cup. "He was worth all of it." "Yes," Caleb said. "He was." The evening went long. Neither of them manufactured reasons for it to go long. It simply did the way evenings go long when the conversation is worth having, and neither person is in a hurry to go back to being alone with their own thoughts. When he finally stood to go, he stood the way he always stood. No performance, no unnecessary weight given to the moment. And he put on his hat and looked at her across Mrs. Hale's kitchen. "I'll come back down," he said. "First Saturday of the month, if that's—" "Yes," she said. She said it before he finished the sentence, and she did not apologize for it. He looked at her for a moment. That same look, complete, direct, without the social machinery that most people kept running between themselves and whatever they actually meant. "Good night, Miss Carter," he said. "Good night, Caleb." He went out. She listened to his horse on the road until the sound was gone, and then she sat at Mrs. Hale's kitchen table, with both hands around her coffee cup, and the jar of blackberry preserves sitting open on the counter with 2 clean spoons beside it, and she let herself feel what she felt, which was not simple, and was not small, and was not anything she had any intention of looking away from. The trial came in November and lasted 11 days. Eliza testified on the 4th day. She wore her good dress, not the pale blue one, which was ash on a foundation 2 miles outside of town, but a new one in dark green that she had made herself because she was a seamstress and because it was right that she should walk into that courtroom wearing something she had built with her own hands. She told the truth. The same truth she had been telling since the afternoon at the church picnic when she held up the ledger page in the middle of the street, clean and sequential, beginning to end. The courtroom was full. Every seat. Standing along the back wall. She spoke clearly enough that the people at the back could hear without straining, and she did not look at Pike or Langley, and she did not perform the grief, and she did not soften the facts for anyone's comfort. When the prosecutor said no further questions, Eliza stood, and she walked back to her seat, and she sat down next to Caleb Rowan, who had come down from the mountain for the duration of the trial, and had sat in the gallery every single day. He didn't say anything when she sat down. He didn't have to. He shifted his weight slightly so that his arm was adjacent to hers, and she could feel the steadiness of him, the way you feel warmth from something solid, and that was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Victor Langley and Amos Pike were convicted on all charges: fraud, conspiracy, and first-degree murder in the death of Thomas James Carter. The judge sentenced them the following morning with the particular gravity that territorial judges applied to cases where the corruption had reached into the structure of the community itself. The sentences were the longest the territorial court had imposed in 3 years. Eliza sat in the courtroom and heard her brother's name said by a judge in a formal proceeding, and followed by the word murdered, and she held very still and let it be what it was: real, final, true. She walked out of the courthouse into the November cold, and Caleb was beside her, and the sun was low and pale above the mountains, and Silver Creek was going about its business around them the way it always did, slightly different than it had been, and still becoming whatever it was going to be. She stopped on the courthouse steps. "It's done," she said. She had said those words to him before in the street in August, and he had said almost. Now he stood beside her and looked at the same word from the same distance, and this time neither of them had a qualification for it. "Yes," he said. She looked at the mountains north of town, the high ridge line where the summer camp sat, the mesa trail, the creek crossing where they had split in the dark, and she had ridden north with 5 armed men behind her, and he had ridden south with the truth in his jacket. All of it visible from here in the cold November air, reduced by distance to clean blue shapes against a pale sky. She had carried the truth through fire and dark, and an empty table, and a canyon that had taken her brother, and a town that had decided what she was before she could say a word in her own defense. She had carried it all the way here. "Come for supper Saturday," she said. "I'll be there," he said. She believed him. She turned from the mountains and walked down the courthouse steps toward Carter Supply and sewing Thomas's name. Above the door, the lamp already lit inside the jar of blackberry preserves on the back shelf, waiting where she had put it, and she walked without looking back. Not because the past didn't matter, but because she already knew everything it contained, and what it contained was hers, and she was carrying it forward, and she was not afraid. Eliza Mae Carter had never been the shamed woman at the empty table. She had always been the woman who carried the truth, and now finally every person in Silver Creek knew exactly which one she was.